You are listening to the Nurse Documentation Podcast, brought to you by Nightingale. Nurse documentation, protect the care you gave, protect the license you hold, with every note you save. Nightingale, where good care is safe.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. I want you to just step into a scenario for a moment, one that is maybe the single most chilling experience for any clinician.
It's a tough one to even think about.
It is. Picture this. It's months, maybe even years after you worked a particular shift. You honestly barely remember the patient, let alone the tiny details of the care you provided.
Right. It's just a blur.
But now, you're in a room, and you're being asked to defend your professional actions. And there's an attorney across from you, and their whole case is built on one single document, your charting in the electronic health record.
And that chart becomes your only voice from that day.
Exactly. That documentation is the single solitary record of the excellent professional life-saving care you gave. It is, and this is terrifying, your only legal defense. But what if that defense is, incomplete?
Or it's rushed, or it's inconsistent.
Right. What if it just doesn't have those crucial details to prove your judgment was sound? We hear this all the time, the frustration that the documentation just doesn't match the quality of the care.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the core idea we really want to anchor this deep dive on.
Yeah.
The problem is almost never the nurse's intent. The problem is the system.
It's the system that's supposed to be supporting the nurse, or, the lack of one.
Yes, exactly. So today, we are diving deep into how one unit took on this systemic challenge using a methodology called the ChartSmart Implementation Kit. And this is for you, whether you're a bedside nurse just trying to get your charting done, a charge nurse, a manager, or an educator.
It really applies to everyone in that chain of care.
It does. And we have the aggregated baseline data from this unit's initial audit, and it is an immediate shock to the system.
It's a wake-up call.
It really is.
Yeah.
In a high-risk area, patient refusals, the initial overall compliance score, basically a measure of how legally defensible the charts were, came in at a dismal 38%.
38%. It's a staggering number.
It's staggering. And that number, it's not an accusation. It's a huge, flashing mandate for change.
Right. It tells you something is fundamentally broken.
So our mission today is to unpack the phased 90-day plan that took that unit from that 38% to, professional documentation excellence.
Mm-hmm.
We want to understand how they built a culture where every single nurse feels confident their charting is legally sound. Okay, let's get into this.
That 38%, it immediately shows the gap, right? The gap between what nurses do and what they actually record.
Exactly.
And, when nurses hear about some new documentation initiative, the first reaction is usually skepticism. It's, oh, here we go again, more busy work from admin.
Total eye roll, yeah.
We have to get ahead of that fear. We have to define what something like ChartSmart is, but maybe more importantly, what it isn't.
Okay.
This program is, at its core, a shield. It's there to protect you and your license. It is not a tool to find fault or to punish people.
So it's not a gotcha system.
No, and it's not more busy work. It's actually about creating efficiency through standardization. When you have a clear, structured way to chart every high-risk situation, it gets faster, it gets clearer, it's less mentally draining because you're not reinventing the wheel every single time.
I do appreciate that reframe, but let me just push back for a second, kind of wear my old manager hat. If the goal is, say, 100% compliance, why focus so much on the system? Aren't we kind of letting staff off the hook by saying it's a system problem?
That's a great question, and it's the conflict that every nurse leader feels. The reason we focus on the system is all about sustainability.
Okay.
You can force perfect charting for a week with punitive measures, but the second you take that pressure off, people just go back to the old way, the path of least resistance. And why is that?
Because the system itself is the path of least resistance.
Exactly. The EHR fields, the workflow, none of it naturally supports excellent charting when you're under stress. The source material confirms what we see everywhere. Countless initiatives fail, and it's usually because there wasn't enough planning and not enough team buy-in.
So they jump the gun.
They do. The guide is very clear that rushing phase 1 is the most common reason for implementation failure. Leaders get excited about the new tools like FDAR, and they just jump straight to training without preparing the ground first.
It's like building a house with no foundation.
Perfect analogy. Before a leader even thinks about launching this, they have to take a step back and really internalize the why. They have to revisit those worst-case scenarios, the legal risks, and define a clear vision. This can't be just another box to check for compliance.
It has to be a real commitment.
A commitment to providing professional defense for every single person on their team.
So let's get into that groundwork, because you stressed it, and it's clear that skipping it just guarantees failure. Phase 1 is called team readiness and onboarding. And this is really that period where a leader takes an idea and turns it into a collective, shared mandate for change.
It's about building momentum before you even start.
Yeah. The roadmap for the leader has this conviction checklist. First, you have to internalize the why. You have to believe in it. Second, you have to master the content.
Oh, that is so key.
Right. If a skeptical nurse asks you a tough question about how a framework handles some messy real-world scenario, you or your champion have to have a fluent answer.
If you don't, you lose all credibility in that moment.
Instantly.
Yeah.
And that leadership role modeling, as you said, it's non-negotiable. If management treats this like it's optional, then the staff will too.
Of course they will.
But step 3, assemble your allies. This might be the most crucial piece of all. This can't feel like it's just coming from the top down.
No, it has to come from within the team.
So the leader has to go out and recruit their documentation champions. And it's a small group, just 2 or 3 respected, detail-oriented nurses who are already positive influencers.
The people everyone already looks up to for their clinical judgment.
Exactly. And why is that peer selection so critical? Because these champions become the co-trainers. They're the ones setting the culture. They're the peer auditors.
And they can speak the language of the unit. They know the reality of a busy shift. They know what shortcuts are tempting.
So they can champion the new system as a benefit, not just another task.
Exactly. A manager might talk about mitigating vicarious liability.
Right. Corporate speak.
Yeah. But a champion says, this note is what keeps you out of a courtroom. That translation is everything.
So then you get to customizing the tools. It seems like a small detail, but the method is very clear. The generic slide decks just don't work.
They create confusion.
The leaders have to go through and edit every checklist, every presentation to match their unit's specific EHR terms and workflows. If your slide says focused assessment, but the EHR calls it a targeted review, you've already lost people.
It creates a disconnect immediately.
And here's the detail that really stuck with me from the source material: the power of physical tools.
This is huge.
The direction is so clear. Do not just email out a PDF. You must print the framework cheat sheets and a legal language reference guide on pocket-sized laminated cards.
That physical tool is a psychological game changer. We're talking about changing behavior under immense pressure.
Right.
A nurse on a crazy busy med-surg floor doesn't have time to log into some portal to find a 3-page guide on refusal documentation. But if the core steps, the right language, is literally hanging from their badge reel,
They'll use it.
they'll use it. It reduces the cognitive load. It makes the right, legally defensible choice the easiest and most accessible choice.
Okay, so after all that groundwork is laid, the leader gets to the big deliverable for phase 1, the baseline documentation audit results.
And this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the evidence that solidifies the mandate for the program.
The audit looked at 50 random charts from the last month, specifically targeting patient refusal documentation. And we already mentioned the headline, that 38% overall compliance score.
Let's talk about that 38%, because the number itself is scary, but the breakdown is even more revealing about the unit's actual legal vulnerability.
Okay.
And this is the moment the leader has to be transparent with the team, not to shame them, but to show them exactly where the risk is and, how easily it can be fixed with a little structure.
So what did that breakdown look like?
Okay, so 4 key parts of a defensible refusal note. First, the team's strength. Refusal documented. Compliance was 92%.
Okay, so that's pretty good. They're noting the event happened.
Excellent. The event itself is recorded. But now, the gaps. Second component, patient educated on risks. Compliance just plummets to 45%.
Wow. That's a huge drop. That's a major liability gap right there.
It's massive. In more than half the cases, the nurse either didn't give the education or, and this is more likely, they gave it, but they just failed to write it down.
And if it's not written down?
Legally, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the third component is the real catastrophic failure point. Patients' understanding assessed and documented.
Let me guess. It's even lower.
Compliance here was a devastating 15%.
15? Wow.
Only 15% of charts had any evidence that the nurse followed up on the education by actually assessing and then documenting that the patient understood the risks of their refusal.
And that's the key legal distinction, isn't it? It has to be an informed refusal.
That is the entire ballgame. You might chart taught patient on risks of refusing medication X, but if you don't chart patient verbalized, I understand if I don't take this, X, Y, and Z could happen, but I still refuse, then you have failed to prove the decision was truly informed.
And legally, a non-informed refusal is just seen as negligence.
It transfers all the liability right back to the nurse in the hospital. That 15% is the single biggest legal vulnerability on that unit.
That's the one that keeps you up at night. That gap between providing the education, the 45%, and then confirming and documenting the understanding, the 15%, that's where the whole system just falls apart.
It's the step that gets skipped when you're under the gun and charting is unstructured.
Let's revisit that anatomy of a lawsuit scenario from the training materials. They use this in the kickoff meeting to really drive home the why.
It's a powerful tool.
Imagine a nurse charted just 2 words. Patient refused Lasix. The patient later decompensates from fluid overload, has a terrible outcome. In the deposition, the attorney asks, did you inform the patient that refusing this could lead to trouble breathing, maybe even needing a ventilator?
And the nurse, who is an excellent caring nurse, says, yes, of course I did. I spent 5 minutes explaining everything.
And that's the trap.
It's the trap, because the attorney just holds up the chart and says, ma'am, with all due respect, if you perform such crucial life-saving education, why didn't you write it down?
The silence in that moment.
It's deafening. And this whole program is designed to make sure a nurse is never in that position where their excellent clinical work is totally undermined by incomplete charting.
The documentation has to be a stand-in for your professional judgment years later.
It has to tell the whole story of the nursing process, including that assessment of the patient's capacity to make an informed choice.
Okay, what was the last baseline gap?
The final one was provider notified. Compliance was at 60%.
That's a big operational risk, too. That 40% failure rate means there's no proof the rest of the care team even knew about a critical refusal.
It risks a serious delay in intervention when that patient's condition inevitably changes.
So you have the shop data, the clear mandate, that powerful lawsuit example. The leader uses all of this to set the team's first big measurable challenge.
Right, the first goal.
The sources say the immediate 60-day goal is to raise that overall compliance score for refusal documentation from that crippling 38% up to over 75%.
That seems incredibly aggressive. I'm sure some people thought that was impossible.
They did. And that brings us back to the challenge you raised before. Wait, 75% in 2 months. How is that realistic?
Yeah, what's the biggest barrier to making that jump? It's realistic because the problem was never the nurse's knowledge or their intent. It was always a lack of structure. They know they should document risks. They just don't have a standard, quick way to do it.
So the biggest barrier was just time, or the perception of time.
Exactly. The champions had to prove that using a standard framework, which feels a little slower at first, actually saves you time in the long run. On edits, on questions, and definitely on liability. You get to 75% just by fixing that 15% item, documenting the patient's understanding.
So moving from 38% to 75% in 60 days means phase 2 standardization and training has to be incredibly focused.
It has to be surgical.
And this stage relies on that 30, 60, 90-day implementation roadmap. This roadmap is so important for managing the team's mental energy. It breaks this huge task down. Month 1 was foundations. Now we're in month 2, days 31 to 60. Standardizing practice and building muscle memory.
And that theme, muscle memory, is perfect because the goal is to install mental software that automates defensible charting. We introduced structured frameworks like FDAR, SOAP, or IAARP.
You called these cognitive relief tools, and I love that reframe. Tell me more about why these aren't more steps, but actually less mental work.
Think about when a nurse is charting a really complex event, a rapid response, a patient fall. They are mentally wiped out.
For sure.
If they have to invent the structure of the story from scratch, they default to emotional or subjective charting. They might write 10 lines but miss the one critical detail a lawyer will look for. A framework removes that invention phase.
It gives you the template.
It's the mental template. It forces you to pause, identify the 4 or 5 critical pieces of the event, and put them in the right order. It makes charting clearer, faster, and relieves that mental pressure.
Let's do a deep dive into FDR because it's often used for charting specific events or changes in condition. Walk us through those 4 components.
Sure. FDR is a beautiful tool for narrative efficiency. First, F is for focus. This is the subject, the problem, and it has to be specific.
So not patient having a bad day.
Exactly. The focus is acute pain, right lower extremity, or patient refusal of Lasix. It sets the scene immediately.
Okay, F is focus. Then D.
D is for data. This is your objective evidence, the measurable facts. Vital signs, specific observations, exact quotes from the patient. This is what proves your assessment skills.
A is for action.
A is action. This is what you, the nurse, did about the data. Interventions, medications, and critically, any communication with the provider time, who you spoke to, what you said. This proves you responded professionally.
And then R.
And R is for response. This is the one that cures that 15% vulnerability we saw in the audit. This proves if your action worked. Did the pain get better? And for refusals, did the patient understand your teaching?
Let's really drill into that response section with the refusal example because that's where the big failure was. How does an FDR note fix that?
Okay, so in a refusal note, the action section detailed the education you provided. Action. Educated patient on risks of fluid overload, including shortness of breath. The response must then confirm the patient's comprehension. A good response would be something like, response. Patient verbalized understanding of risks, stating, I know I might get short of breath, but I still don't want it. Patient remains alert and oriented.
And an unacceptable response would be?
Response. Patient stable. That's unacceptable because it fails to capture the cognitive follow-through. It doesn't prove the decision was informed. The framework itself, by demanding a response, guides the nurse to that legally critical step.
That distinction is so important, and the training isn't just a lecture. The sources talk about using a simulation and case study library.
This is where theory becomes muscle memory.
Right. In week 6, they're not just defining FDR. They're practicing with scenarios from their own unit's high-risk events, like post-op patient with an acute change in condition. And the nurses have to actually write the FDR note for that scenario.
And that case study approach standardizes the language for the whole unit. If the unit decides that for a post-op complication, the action must always include an SBR communication to the provider, the training reinforces that. It makes the required steps automatic.
And this practice brings us to the model itself, which isn't a top-down mandate. The sources call it the peer-to-peer model. The documentation champions are the ones who lead these workshops. Why is that peer-led approach so much more effective?
Credibility and empathy. A manager, no matter how great, isn't juggling 7 patients at 2 in the morning.
Right.
A documentation champion is. So when a champion teaches a framework, they can anticipate the objections. They can say, look, I know this feels slower right now, but I used this for a septic patient last week. It took me 2 minutes, and it saved me 10 minutes of worrying later. That testimony is gold.
It changes it from a mandate to a shared best practice.
Absolutely. And to really cement this, the push for muscle memory continues. After the workshops, they do daily brief case study practice in huddles. And critically, they introduce informal peer review.
How do you do peer review without making it feel scary or punitive?
You frame it as a shared professional responsibility. Nurses pair up and just review one another's notes, focusing only on the structure. Does this note have a clear focus? Did you document the provider call in the action? Was the response complete?
So it's not about judgment, it's about checking the boxes of the framework.
Exactly. The goal is to normalize asking for a second set of eyes on a high-risk note. Make it a sign of professionalism, not weakness. It's like a pilot and co-pilot running a checklist.
So once the team has the frameworks down, the curriculum shifts in week 7 to workshop module 3, risk mitigation and legal awareness.
Right. This connects the structure they just learned directly to liability protection. It's about empowerment, showing them how their charting is a shield.
The training gets really specific here, focusing on the top 3 documentation errors that lead to lawsuits. We should probably name these.
We should. Number 1 is failure to document informed refusal or consent. We saw this in the 15% compliance rate. If you don't prove the patient understood the consequences, their decision isn't legally informed.
Okay, what's number 2?
Inconsistent or delayed documentation of provider communication. This is a huge one in delayed care lawsuits. If you notify a provider at 2 o'clock but don't chart it until 4:30, the other side will argue you delayed notification for 2.5 hours.
And the third one?
Charting by exception without a clear baseline. This is a legal minefield. If your baseline assessment is vague, like skin WNL, and later a pressure ulcer develops, your defense is gone. You need a robust, objective baseline to measure all exceptions against.
So those three errors are basically the openings an attorney is looking for. This is where that legal language reference guide really comes into play.
It moves from theory to a working tool.
That laminated card now has specific, precise language for these scenarios. So instead of patient was annoying, the guide tells you to use objective language.
Right. Patient verbally refused transfer, stating, "I will not move." Nurse educated patient on transfer necessity. Patient remains noncompliant. Objective. Factual. Defensible.
Let's go back to that provider notification gap, that 60% compliance rate. If a critical lab comes back, what are the key things that must be in that note?
5 non-negotiable elements. Who you notified, when you notified them, documented immediately, what you told them, what orders or response you received, and finally, what action you took next and the patient's response.
Miss any one of those, and you've left a communication gap.
A gap a lawyer can drive a truck through.
So the goal was to get to 75% compliance on refusal documentation in 60 days. How did this training specifically make that happen?
It was the combination of the structure and the targeted repetition. Phase 2 gave them the FDAR framework, which prompts them to complete all 4 steps. Then Phase 3, the legal training, focused their attention like a laser on that 15% failure point, documenting the patient's understanding.
So they just hammered that one point home.
Over and over. They realized that adding that one specific response line takes 15 seconds, but it buys you years of professional protection.
Which brings us back to the most critical takeaway for any nurse listening. This charting isn't for the next shift. It is protection long after your shift ends.
That's the whole point.
Let's use another high-risk scenario, like a patient fall. Years later, that chart has to show flawless judgment. Using these frameworks, it has to show your immediate assessment,
The data.
the immediate safety interventions you put in place,
The action.
that you educated the patient on calling for help and that they understood,
The legal language.
and your ongoing monitoring plan.
The response. And if the chart clearly shows all of those steps, structured by FDAR, it creates this powerful, undeniable narrative of competence. The documentation becomes your primary defense.
So we've built the foundation in Phase 1. We've developed the skills in Phase 2. Now we get to Phase 3. Monitoring and reinforcement. This is what separates successful programs from those, flash-in-the-pan initiatives.
This is what makes it stick. The goal is making these new practices permanent, embedded habits.
And the mantra here is so important. Sustainable change is about progress, not perfection. You can't get defeated if you dip from 78% back to 75%. The focus is keeping that long-term trend way above that disastrous 38%.
And sustainability requires visible accountability. This is where the program introduces 2 really powerful tools: a public-facing documentation KPI dashboard and a monthly audit tracker.
Let's talk about that dashboard. Why is making the performance visible so effective?
Because it creates shared ownership. If the data is locked away in a manager's office, it's a management problem. If it's on a screen in the break room, it's a team responsibility.
So what metrics are you tracking on it?
3 core things.
Yeah.
The big one, the overall compliance score. Then compliance by framework component. This is huge for coaching. It might show your action compliance is 95%, but response is only 80%. That tells you exactly where to focus.
And the third?
High-risk scenario compliance, to make sure you're sustaining the gains in those key areas like refusals. That visual story, starting at 38%, spiking to 52%, and then stabilizing at 78%, it validates all the hard work.
It turns data from a tool of surveillance into a tool for motivation.
Exactly. And that validation leads to the crucial transition in Week 10, champion-led ownership. The documentation champions take over the audit process completely.
So they're not just doing the audits, they're crunching the numbers and presenting the update.
They're running the system. This is essential for sustainability. If the manager is the only one who knows how to do it, the system dies the minute they go on vacation. By handing the reins to the peers, you embed the system permanently.
At this point, the leader's role totally shifts. They stop being the enforcer and become the coach.
And this is what leaders so often underestimate. A compliance score of 78% means 22% of charts still have gaps. That 22% needs personalized support, not another memo.
So this is where the one-on-one coaching sessions come in, using the audit data. The guide strongly recommends using the G-O-W model for these conversations.
Yes, because the GROW model ensures the conversation is supportive and focused on future solutions, not past mistakes.
I love this model for this. It reframes it from discipline to professional development. Let's walk through what GROW actually stands for.
Okay, G is for goal. Clarify the professional standard. Our unit goal is 90% compliance on the response component.
Okay, G is goal, R.
R is reality. Objectively review the data. Your last 5 audits show the response section is missing about a quarter of the time, especially with critical values. O is for options. This is collaborative. The leader doesn't give the answer, they help the nurse find their own. What could help you remember to document the response? A phone alarm, a sticky note.
And finally, WL.
W is for will. This is the commitment. Okay, based on our chat, what's one specific thing you will commit to doing this week to make sure that response gets documented every time?
Let's apply that to a real-world example. Say a nurse, Sarah, is consistently missing that response component. How did that coaching session sound?
Okay, so the leader sits with Sarah. Goal. Sarah, our goal is 95% completeness on your FDAR notes, especially that response. Reality. The data shows you're great on action, but you're missing the follow-up assessment. What happens right after you chart the action?
And Sarah might say, I immediately get pulled away by another patient's alarm.
Exactly. So, options. Okay, since you get pulled away, what prompt could bring you back to the chart? Could we use the draft note feature? What do you think would work for you? And then we'll. Great. For the next 2 weeks, you're going to try setting a phone alarm labeled response check every 30 minutes. I'll check back with you next Tuesday.
It's so supportive and concrete. The power there is it shifts the responsibility for the solution back to the nurse, which builds that real professional ownership.
And that ownership gets even bigger in week 11 with team-led improvement. The champions present the audit findings to the whole team and lead the discussion. What are we doing well? Where are we still struggling? And most importantly, why is this gap still here?
So the team identifies the root cause and brainstorms the solutions together.
Yes. If timeliness is still an issue, the team, not the manager, might suggest a change to the shift handover process. Because they created the solution, it's practical, it's realistic, and they buy into it instantly.
And finally, after all this intense work, you have to celebrate.
You absolutely have to. Formally recognize the champions. Share the final progress story. Issue certificates of completion to every staff member. You have to acknowledge the hard work that goes into changing habits. Consistency, visibility, and celebration. That's the key to long-term excellence.
You know, the transformation we've been talking about, it's about so much more than just improving a compliance score. It's about building a culture where documentation is finally seen for what it is. A professional act of communication.
It's not clerical work.
It's not clerical work you squeeze in at the end of a 12-hour shift.
Yeah.
When you look at the whole journey, using that shock data to create a mandate, building skills with tools like FDAR, empowering peers with the GROW model, it just fundamentally reframes the work. And it encourages you, the listener, to think beyond just getting through the shift. It urges you to see that your documentation is the legal and professional reflection of your expertise. It's your ultimate defense.
It is. And that defense is your leader's commitment to you. The leader's energy, their consistency, their belief in the team, that's what determines the outcome. The structure gives you the map, but leadership and the champions provide the fuel for the long haul.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I want you to just take a moment and reflect on your own unit's documentation culture. If your unit were audited today on a high-risk scenario, say, charting a change in condition and provider notification, what compliance score do you honestly think you would see?
That's a tough question.
It is. And more importantly, what does that score, whatever you imagined, tell you about the investment currently being made in your team's confidence and ultimately in their professional defense against risk years from now?
That's a powerful question. It really underscores the need to move toward this kind of structured, peer-supported excellence. We encourage you to explore these phased approaches, inspired by the ChartSmart methodology, focus on structure, supportive coaching, and celebrating every single step of progress. Become confident, become audit-ready, and achieve that professional excellence.
You are listening to the Nurse Documentation Podcast, brought to you by Nightingale. Nurse Documentation. Protect the care you gave. Protect the license you hold. With every note you save. Nightingale, where good care is safe.